Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the latest episode of the Writers Podcast. I have with me today special guest Bill Hemmig. Hello, Bill. How are you doing?
I am very well, Lou. How are you?
Great to have you aboard, and looking forward to talking about your book, Americana Stories.
Nice to be
Uh,
here.
awesome. And so, before we get into that, just to get a little bit of background about yourself, why don't you tell the listeners what kind of a writer you are and the kind of stories that you like to write?
Now I'm writing short fiction, but I actually started out as a playwright.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, I lived in New York for a bunch of years and I had a few off Broadway and regional productions. And then things kind of dried up.
Mm,
So, and I lost a lot of my connections. So much of the theater is collaborative. And when your collaborators drift away, and also I moved out of town. But
mm,
I eventually decided, since I was writing in isolation again, I thought I'd try fiction, and I started out writing a novel. But since I have to have a day job to pay the bills, this novel was taking forever and ever. And a
mm,
friend of mine, suggested, "Why don't you try short stories? Because they don't take as
mm.
long."
Right.
And I did. And my first attempt at a short story, I had too much story for a short story, and it turned into a novella.
Mm,
And that's how I found my publisher, Read Furiously. That was one of the first things of mine they published, was the novella. And then I learned how to craft short stories, and my collection Americana came out last summer.
okay, very cool. So let's get a little bit of background on yourself then. So, are you would you consider yourself an avid reader?
I would like to be a much more avid reader than I
Mm,
am.
mm,
I do read quite a bit. I
okay.
read more nonfiction than I do fiction.
Ah,
I get a lot of like history and mythology and biographies, and uh, I get a lot of ideas from nonfiction.
okay. Uh,
I'm actually, as far as influences goes, I'm much more influenced by music than I am by other
oh,
fiction writers.
interesting. And what kind of music?
Classical mostly, but I like jazz too.
Mm,
I also like I like rock, but I don't think that has that much effect on my work.
okay.
Classical music has set structures, and I just like to. It helps me shape. After I get through a first draft, I don't worry about this sort of thing in a first draft. But once I
Mm-hmm.
get to a first draft, I might notice that there's a musical structure in there,
Mm,
and that will help me shape the story when I'm revising it. And also, I like to, introduce themes, develop them, repeat them, bring them back in different guises, the way music does.
okay. That's very interesting. I just out of curiosity, would you include musical scores like for movies as classical music, or are you strictly talking like the
Um,
more rigid definition?
I tend to be more influenced by the more rigid definition, but
Okay.
I do like movie score music.
Okay, very cool. So growing up, w were you a reader as you were growing up? And, I assume you didn't read nonfiction when you were younger. Did you have, like, fiction writers that you liked or anything of that?
Yes, actually, my earliest memories as a reader, when my mother did the dishes, she used to plant me on a stool in the kitchen and make me read Dr. Seuss books to her. At a very young age, I learned to wrap my mouth around some rather complicated vocabulary.
Right, right, and
But I I was drawn to horror and supernatural stories when I was
okay,
younger. I devoured like all of Edgar Allan Poe when I was in junior high school.
cool.
Um, Shakespeare too. I
Mhm,
read most of Shakespeare when I was in junior high, when I wasn't even assigned them for, school assignments.
mm,
And I remember when I was in junior high and high school, the first two major things that I worked on writing. Um, although I didn't finish either of them because of my love for Shakespeare, but also because of my fondness for the supernatural. I was completely addicted to the soap opera Dark Shadows
Okay, right.
as a kid.
Yeah.
So the two things that I wrote in my youth or attempted to was a novel about seventh graders based on the Merry Wives of Windsor,
Mm,
which was interesting, and
right.
also a 5-act play about vampires
Cool.
that I never finished.
Okay. So your educational background, was it focused on the creative arts, writing, or you said you're a playwright, so I assume that was in there mix somewhere?
Yeah, I my undergraduate degrees in the history of art, and then I got detoured by the theater, and yeah, that's when I decided I was going to, try to establish myself as a playwright.
Mhm.
Um, Around the time when my theater opportunities started disappearing, I realized that I was over 40 and didn't have a retirement fund. So I went back to grad school and got a master's degree in library science and became an academic librarian. And
Oh,
it was around the time that I graduated from the graduate program that I started writing short fiction.
okay. So, I'm not as well versed in short stories, as I am as novels, and I think that goes for a lot of people, but, were there short story writers that you like? Like, I'm thinking, like, for myself, like, maybe a Harlan Ellison or, Walter Omidi, kind of writers
Well,
or
I mean, Anton Chekhov is like the master of the short story.
okay,
Poe as well. I mean, he
and
was my
Paul, right,
Poe was my first real exposure to short fiction.
okay.
Outside of school. Um, Otherwise, I'm kind of coming up. I really don't. I should. It sounds like I'm a terrible reader, but I really don't read a lot of fiction, and if I
Right,
do, it's usually novels.
right. Okay, so that's interesting then because your book, Americana Stories, is fiction, correct?
Yes.
So that's an interesting dichotomy for you. If your input is all nonfiction and yet your output is fiction. There must be some magic in there.
Well, again, it's the I consider these to be sort of prose musical compositions.
Okay.
So, I mean, that's really where most of my influence comes from. I mean, I start with a couple characters in a situation and I just dive in, and that's the way I do a first draft, is to
Right.
just dive in with no thought to the structure of the story or even what the subject matter is going to be. Or,
Okay.
I don't worry what it's about until after the first draft and sometimes well after.
Okay.
That
So you're
that's
definitely a very free form writer.
Yeah.
Okay. So you don't like to outline.
Only if I have to.
Right.
I have, the short story that comes to mind. It's not in the collection. It was published in one of Reed Furiously's. They're doing a series of anthologies with writings about New Jersey, and I have stories in the first two of those.
Okay.
And one of them basically involves a car race.
Hmm.
Um, Boils down to the three super massive cars, all trying to get ahead of each other on a 4-lane highway before it
Hmm.
goes down to 2 lanes. And that one, I had to literally draw a map
Hmm.
of how that car race proceeded
Okay.
and what obstacles got in the way and who was in front of who and who was blocking traffic coming the other direction. And
Hmm.
normally I
Okay.
don't go with an outline, but for something like that, and I'm
All
also
right.
I'm a pretty visual person, so having a map in front of me was really helpful.
Right, right, for sure. So you mentioned that you get a lot of your inspiration from nonfiction. Um, can you is there a certain genre or type of nonfiction? Like, are you reading historical fiction, autobiographies, or a
Um,
whole range, a broad
all of
spectrum?
the above. One of the stories in the collection, um, I kind of devoured all of Joseph Campbell about 30 years ago,
Right.
and in one of his books, he discusses the the culture and the social of the rituals of an Australian Aboriginal tribe.
Mm,
And one of my stories, which is flash fiction, which if you or your listeners aren't familiar, flash fiction is usually defined as a short story that's less than 1,000 words. And
right.
I have 5 of those in the book, and then 6
Okay.
regular length short stories. But one of the flash fiction pieces is about an American student who becomes fascinated by this Aboriginal tribe.
Mm,
So
okay.
that's a pretty good example of how I get influenced by my reading.
Right. Okay. So in your because you're freeform in that, I'm just curious, are your stories, do they stay grounded in reality, or do you venture into supernatural
Ooh,
fantastical elements?
that is a good question. Um, some of them, well, I'm gonna say mostly no.
Okay.
Um, my editor calls me an absurdist writer. I'm
Okay.
not entirely sure I agree with that, but maybe that's because my brain works in absurd ways, and I'm just so used to it. I don't recognize it as such.
Right. That's norm for you.
But well, for instance, the first story in the collection, The Backside of Disneyland, is about a woman who's in um, California for a conference, and she has 3 imaginary friends who she derived from literature.
Mm,
One of them is Portia from The Merchant of Venice. One's Mrs. Dalloway, and the other is Elizabeth from Pride and Prejudice. And
mm,
she came up with these incredible backstories about what they've been doing lately. I mean, Liz Darcy is a women's shoe designer, and I think that's where the absurdity comes in. But she's made up all these, and she has conversations with them. She's in a bad marriage, and her imaginary friends are trying to talk her into either making the marriage better or getting out.
mhm.
So it's sort of, you get the interior workings of her mind through the conversations she's having with these imaginary friends.
Okay. Very cool. Now, you said sometimes you write these stories and you just let them sit for a while, and then you come back to them. Did I hear that correctly? Or
Very often, yes.
right,
So I can get a clear view
a little
and really
perspective.
really dig in and say, okay, what am I actually doing here, and how can I make that clearer?
Right. And the goal of your stories is it a thematic thing that you're trying to strive, or is it just an exploration of character? Like what are you aiming for with these stories?
It's both.
Mhm.
There's one of the stories in the book is about a man whose partner has recently passed away, and he's in the process of clearing out the house that they had together in order to put it on the market.
Mhm.
And I decided to intersperse the narrative of that with some vignettes that were based on my experiences doing community and college theater. Um, and flashbacks that the main character is having of when he was in that situation and they were striking a set, which basically means demolishing it after the show is over and clearing the stage. And
Yep.
I was finding parallels between the clearing of the house and the striking of the set, and the emotions that both of those things
Oh, okay.
br- bring to mind. Um, I think in retrospect, I wasn't just, saying, because I was in that situation. I wasn't just saying goodbye to my partner, but I think that was also my valedictory to the theater. And I didn't
Mm,
quite realize that while I was doing it. I thought I was just making some cool parallels.
right. Right. And have you discovered that that's more often than not true, that there's a part of you in these stories? Maybe you're doing yourself some psychoanalysis. I don't know.
Most often, there's one story about a man who has pretty serious obsessive compulsive disorder, and
Hmm.
it's a battle for him to get out of the house in the morning because he's got all these little things he needs to do before he can
Right.
leave.
Right.
And it's an exaggeration, but not as much of an exaggeration of me as I would like to think. So
Okay,
there is some of me in most of these stories, not the one about the student with the Aboriginal Australians, but many of
sure.
them.
Okay, and so, how many stories are in this collection? Do you know off the
11.
top? 11? And what time period of writing does that span for you?
Oh, about a decade.
Oh, okay. Eh,
Again, I have a full-time career that pays the bills,
sure.
and I can write weekends, evenings, holidays, breaks from school because I'm a higher ed administrator.
Mhm.
And that's the other thing I had to learn. You can't wait for the muse to strike when you're pressed for time like that. If you've got
Right.
some free time and you can write, write.
Okay. Do you try to set, like, a word count goal, a daily word count goal for yourself, or
I don't.
you don't? Okay.
No, uh, I just write until either I'm out of time or my brain
Right.
just wants me to stop.
Sure. Okay, are you do you are you more creative in the morning or later in the day, or, like, when do you usually do most of your writing?
I if left to my own devices, I prefer the morning, but I
Mhm.
don't always have the morning.
Mm.
So,
Okay.
but I'm getting better. I'm getting better with afternoons.
Mhm.
I used to just after lunch I just want a nap, and
Yeah.
I think I got myself out of that.
Yeah.
So I have been doing some pretty good work, especially in the late afternoon recently.
Okay. So once you've got a story done, and the first draft, which Stephen King calls writing behind the closed door, do you open the door and send it out to beta readers to get their feedback? Or how does that work for you?
I have a friend who is a novelist and a poet. We've known each other for probably 15 years,
Okay.
and I sent him all of my first. Well, I call them first drafts. Sometimes I'm not willing to call it a first draft until I've been through it 3 or 4 times.
Sure.
Um, but I sent him my official first drafts, and he always sends back really incisive comments with what he likes, what he
Hmm.
thinks is missing, and he's nearly always correct.
Oh, cool. Well, it's very
So
valuable to have a
I
resource like
value
that.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So you've got this book out now, and uh, it's been out for a while. But what have you been doing since the publication of the book? You still writing more
Still
short stories?
writing,
Yeah.
working on the next collection. I
Okay.
have 4 stories
Hmm.
now. The collection went to bed with the publisher maybe about a year before it actually came out. So I've been
Right.
for the past maybe year and a half. I've managed to churn out 4 more stories. 2 of them have been published in online journals,
Okay.
but they ought to be in the next collection.
Very cool. And is there any change in direction for you since the first book came out? Do you feel um, more confident as a writer? Has your process changed in any way, or are you still just going the way
I
you
am
were before?
probably a little more willing to be experimental than
Mhm.
I was originally. There's one story that I haven't talked about in the collection that's completely off the wall.
Mm.
Um, about actually, it's the only thing I wrote with a librarian as a main character, considering I am one. Um, but he's a grade school librarian, and he gets sick, and the title is "Nobody Likes to Be Sick,"
Mhm.
and starts having these visual and audio hallucinations that draw in his childhood and his mother and his father who abandoned the family, and cats figure prominently in it. It gets very surreal after a while,
Mm.
and and it turned out to be my editor's favorite story in the collection, and
Hmm.
that's really encouraged me to keep going in that experimental vein.
Very cool. And your aspirations, yes, have still have aspirations to write a novel, or where's that
I
sitting with you?
I do, but that's going to wait for retirement. Then I can
Oh,
write full
okay.
time.
Okay. Very good. So you'll have lots of ideas by the time you get to that point, I'm
In
sure.
the Yeah, I already do. Yeah,
Yeah,
in the meantime, I'm working on the next story collection.
very cool. And, do you have a targeted date for when that's gonna be ready? Or
Not really. It's probably another couple of years,
okay,
considering
understandable.
what my output has been.
Right, right. Well, short stories are a very unique form of storytelling. Like flash fiction is like the most, condensed version, but even like a 5,000, 8,000 word short story, you really have to be economical with your word choices and storytelling points. So it's a different beast than running a novel, that's for sure.
Yeah, and you can't digress like you
Hmm.
can in a novel and
Yeah,
sort of get off track for a while and then swing back over. It's short
yeah,
stories are much more straightforward.
yeah. Do you Do you find yourself, having to take out words to your short stories or putting in words more often?
Both, actually.
Ah,
Y
interesting.
Yeah, well, that's the challenging part is when you get down to revisions that
Mhm.
granular. Um, yeah, sometimes I'll cut entire paragraphs, and sometimes I'll realize that I need a paragraph in here that I didn't write. It
Right.
really just depends on how the piece is shaped up in the first place.
Okay. Very good. So your collection, Americana Stories, is a collection of 11 stories, and it's out from, who's the publisher again? First
Read furiously.
Furiously. Read
They're out
Furiously.
they're out
That's a
of
great
te
name, actually.
It is.
Yeah. And, so I assume it's available everywhere? The
It's
normal
available,
channels?
yeah, it's available on Amazon, it's available directly through the publisher. If somebody is as fond of independent bookstores as I am, your independent bookstore will get it for you.
Cool. And, is there anything else that you would like to mention that hasn't come up yet in the course of our talk?
Well, if anybody wants to find out more about my work, I'm a member of an organization called the Arts and Cultural Council of Bucks County,
Okay.
and if anybody searches for that on Google, just look for a drop-down menu for member. I think they call them. They're not, well, they're profiles basically, but I think they call
Okay.
them gallery pages. And I have a page under there. Just look for
Okay.
Bill Hemmig, alphabetical by first name, so I'm pretty close to the top. Um,
That's
but
good.
you can get information about my other work, and if I have things that are online, there are links to those.
Okay, very cool. Well, I thank you very much for your time, Bill. I
Thank you,
wish
Lou.
you
This has
all
been fun.
great. I wish you all the success with your future short stories, and,
Thank you.
the next time your next book comes out, if we're still both around in a couple of years, then we'll have to do this again.
That would be great. But yeah, I appreciate this opportunity.
Not a problem. Thank you very much. Take
Okay.
care.
Thank
Enjoy the
you.
rest of your day.
Thank you. You
All
too.
right.